There we go. I'm Beth Godett. I am an adjunct professor in school law. I'm a retired school administrator, and after going to law school, my specialization is taking a look at education through a legal lens. And so when we had COVID-19 and our education changed to, in very many ways, virtual learning, the question came up as to whether or not students were able to access education and to access learning. And I know it was a problem here in the US. I'm sure it was a problem in your countries as well, in varying degrees. But I took a look at that to decide, you know, does education lack the resilience? What we usually did in education, was it working, and how is it working now when we're dealing with a lot of technology that in some cases students don't necessarily have? So what the conclusion I came to from my study is yes, to a certain extent, education as we do it currently in the United States does lack resilience to change the format that we use to teach. And this, we have been saying, gives us a tremendous opportunity to rethink how students learn and how we present education. But what does that mean in terms of the courts? So the Supreme Court, which of course has a lot of law for our country as a whole, and it's considered precedential, which means it applies to everyone, no matter where you are in this country, as opposed to the individual states. Supreme Court has debated who, you know, the question has come up, who is responsible for education in the United States? And essentially, the Supreme Court has never said that it's a responsibility of the country as a whole, the federal government. It is not in our Constitution, it is actually in the state constitutions. That's how the right to education is guaranteed. You know, who suffers? Well, that depends. We have a lot of groups in this country that have been viewed as being marginalized. Their opportunities are limited by a variety of reasons. And the controversy comes about when you take a look at the role the Supreme Court has had. There's been a lot of discussion on the court itself as to its involvement with the authority of the schools. Does it have a voice in our individual schools? And does it want to be viewed as the school board for the entire country? And basically, even though in many cases the court, the justices have said no, it has in certain cases basically intruded on school authority and made some decisions for schools. In a big way, that decision, the decision about funding, how schools are funded, has limited students' access, because students in this decision from the 1970s, the Rodriguez decision, students who live in poorer communities, this decision said the state doesn't have to fund students' education equally. So you could live in a wealthier district where there's a greater tax base, and you could get more money for your schools than if you live in a poorer community. And the court said that that's perfectly fine. Unfortunately, that marginalizes students. The whole issue of civil rights, and going back to the 1800s and the late 1800s, the Plessy case, and then in the middle 1900s, Brown case in 1954, and the Milliken case, the idea that we can, in fact, limit the ability of students to have an equal education. Plessy set forth something we know as separate but equal, so that you can have a school that services white students, and you can have a school that serves students of color. And as long as the facilities and the equipment and the teachers and everything are considered to be equal, then that's okay. The unfortunate reality is that that hasn't been the case. Equal hasn't really been equal. And so the courts have tried to right that wrong in the cases in the 1900s. However, there was a constant fight, and the court in Milliken, for example, more or less established that, okay, you know, you're going to have schools that are in many cases inner cities, schools where a lot of students who perhaps may be poor, perhaps maybe students of color, they will have a very different experience from the students who are living more in the suburbs, who have a greater wealth, and who are benefiting from a different kind of education. The last issue that has come up this past year, especially the Espinoza case, is the idea of where do the states have a responsibility to religious and private schools to fund that. And more of the public funds are being given to religious institutions in different ways, even though originally, long ago, there was set forth in our Constitution a separation between the church and the state, and it was viewed that the public monies should go to the public schools. That is changing, and so there is a concern that students will be leaving the public schools to go to alternatives, especially after what's been going on in COVID, where it's been found that perhaps many private schools have been physically in session and public schools have tended to be more remote. And so as a result, there's been a concern about the equity of education in those cases. The circuit courts, which have, our country is divided up into different circuits, and there are 13 different circuits, basically regional courts that are federal courts, that are courts of appeal, also state courts, and the legislature itself, the Congress, both the federal Congress and the state Congresses. They have tried to issue some of their own legislation to, in some ways, mitigate the situations that some students are receiving a lesser education than others. However, again, it varies. The Capuchon case overturned Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg. That was a case where it was ruled that it's okay to bus students from where they live to another school so that they are able to achieve equity, to have better opportunities, and to integrate schools so that students are able to go to school with many different students and gain an appreciation for what different students from different races and cultures and ethnicities have to bring, and so on. However, this Capuchon case in 2001 basically said, okay, our schools are now integrated and we no longer need to do these things like busing. And so by doing that, unfortunately, what will happen and what is happening is that schools are little by little going back to becoming much more segregated, which was what the courts sought to undo in the 50s, starting in the 50s. One of the more recent cases is Gary B. versus Whitmer out of Michigan, which actually determined that students have a fundamental right to be literate. And that was a case where the governor of Michigan actually decided to settle the case before the courts were able to do that, which was a good thing. She provided extra funding to ensure that areas where students were lacking resources and were very much in need of a more equitable education. In this case, we're talking about the city of Detroit, were given those resources. And a lot of courts are now citing that Gary B case as really important to their thinking that this is a need. The legislature has passed different legislation. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act. Section 504 also was making accommodations for people with disabilities. Title IX tried to end discrimination by gender. These were pieces of legislation, among others, that tried to sidestep the rules of the courts to work toward greater equity. And in many cases, they have been very, very successful in doing that. But there are still issues. And a lot of times they come up through individual state court cases, the Abbott case in New Jersey, William Penn case in Pennsylvania, talking about how even now, after so many years of trying, we are still not equitably funding our schools so that all students are guaranteed a basic education. And that's the other part of the problem. We really haven't determined what exactly a basic education means, what that includes. So the Leandro case, which is very recent in North Carolina, basically tried to establish some ground rules. And they've said that means access to high quality learning opportunities, adequate resources, a high quality staff, not only in teachers, but also in terms of leadership. And that is a case, some of these cases go on for years. This particular case is, there was actually a commission that was put forth by the court to say, not only is this the ruling of the court, but we're going to watch to make sure that you implement this ruling. You're not going to be able to just forget about it. At the beginning of COVID closures, there was a case against Mayor de Blasio in New York, saying that students with special needs were being denied what's called a free, appropriate public education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This suit was dismissed for a number of reasons, but there have been a lot of concerns regarding students with special need and the services they've been able to receive during COVID closures. There have been school districts, like in the Dembly case, that where they've been suing schools to reopen. And in some cases, this is because parents are having difficulty getting back to work themselves because they need to be there with their students. And then this case, the AC versus Raimondo out of Rhode Island, again, another case from 2020. There was a lot going on in 2020 where students were essentially suing because they felt they weren't being given what they needed to develop a civic awareness and responsibility. So students are what we call marginalized. They are not receiving what they need to receive in many different ways, by race, ethnicity, poverty and wealth, homelessness, students who don't know where they're going to be sleeping from one night to the next. And even though they may have computers, they don't have necessarily access to bandwidth or internet. Students who are undocumented, who are really afraid to go to school because they don't know whether they'll be able to remain in this country. They're scared, and understandably so. English language learners and their families, students lacking technology access, again, the poorly funded schools, students of affluence. This is kind of a twist. Students who come from affluent families, but whose parents are not at home during the day. They are at work. There are other people caring for them, but they're not necessarily people who are able to assist them with, or who are in a position to assist them. That's not their role with learning. And then students that we worry about now who are suffering abuse because they're at home during COVID. Perhaps they've been in abusive situations at the start, or they may be suffering their own what could be post-traumatic stress disorder, students who have lost parents as a result of COVID and find it very, very hard to attend to education. So this slide is probably the most important to bear in mind what happens next. One of the things that we're looking at, the press likes to focus on the term learning loss. However, it's very difficult to lose something that you really haven't gained in the first place, or to lose something if you've already gained it, if it's something that you already have. And so what we're looking at right now is saying, speak to the children. There are so many things that they have learned during these COVID closures. There are so many ways that they've accessed learning that we might not even be aware of. So we need to listen to them. We need to speak to the teachers as well, to look at the positive with access to learning, so that we can capitalize that. We have to look at what this COVID closures and virtual learning have exposed, the cracks in our system, and where we need to make it better. Taking advantage of the opportunities presented to think differently about how children learn and what that means in today's world. And that, Kelvin, speaks to also what you were talking about with the global awareness. You know, it's so important that we become a part of our global society. And I think the COVID experience, which has been so horrific, if we can take anything away from it, it has taught us that it's really important for us to gain that perspective. And for us, and I know this is not a consideration in the same way as it is in the United States and other countries, but we use a lot of standardized assessments, and that tends to put students in boxes. It stifles their growth. It denies their potential. It limits what they think of themselves and what the system in education thinks of them as well. So it really does limit their access to education. And so we need to really rethink this. And that's a problem for us because the testing comes from companies that have made a very strong business out of preparing tests, grading tests, and it costs a lot of money, excuse me, for states to administer these tests. So it's these are all things that are to be considered. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention, and I look forward to sharing more from the conference and from all of you.